The first sheriff's truck rolled into Maple Ridge Estates at 4:12 in the morning. By sunrise, there were 3 more behind it, plus 2 county flood response vehicles and a National Guard transport rumbling through 6 inches of muddy water where the neighborhood entrance used to be. I stood on my porch in work boots holding a manila folder while Karen Whitmore screamed at a deputy across the flooded street. "You knew this would happen," she shouted, soaking wet, mascara running down her face. "You planned this." I didn't answer her. I just opened the folder and handed the deputy 2 documents. The first was the certified county permit approving the legal removal of my family's retention dam. The second was the HOA violation notice Karen herself had mailed me 8 months earlier demanding I tear it down. The deputy looked at both papers. Then he looked back at Karen. That was the moment the entire neighborhood realized the flood wasn't an accident. It was exactly what they had asked for. If you're still awake out there tonight, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your town. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. And if you like slow burn stories about property fights, HOA disasters, and people pushing the wrong man too far, go ahead and subscribe. We've got plenty more coming. Now, to understand how all of this started, you need to understand the land first. My name's Grant Mercer. I'm 63 years old, and my family has lived on the same stretch of property outside of Ashton Ridge, Tennessee since 1889. 140 acres. Mostly hardwood forest, pasture land, and low creek basin running along the eastern edge of the property. My grandfather built the retention levee there in 1954 after a spring flood washed out half the county road and drowned 40 head of cattle across 3 neighboring farms. Back then, people around here didn't wait for government grants or environmental studies. If something flooded every spring, men got together, rented equipment, and fixed it themselves. The levee wasn't pretty? Never was. It stretched almost 400 feet across the low basin behind our property line, reinforced with stone, packed clay, and concrete culverts that redirected excess creek overflow into an older drainage channel leading south toward county wetlands. It worked for over 70 years, which is exactly why people stopped noticing it. That changed in 2021. That was when Blackwater Development built Maple Ridge Estates downstream. 86 homes, gated entrance, decorative lanterns, artificial pond with a fountain that never worked right. The kind of neighborhood where every mailbox matched and every garage door looked freshly painted all year long. The developer was a man named Richard Whitmore. Tall guy, expensive watch, always dressed like he was about to tee off at a golf course. His wife Karen became HOA president before construction on Phase 2 even finished. Karen Whitmore treated that title like she'd been elected governor. The first time she came onto my property was a Thursday afternoon in late September. I was replacing fence posts near the creek when a white Mercedes SUV rolled halfway across my grass without asking. Karen stepped out wearing sunglasses big enough to cover half her face. She smiled the way people smile when they already think they outrank you. "Mr. Mercer," she asked. "That's me." She looked past me toward the levee. "I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Maple Ridge HOA. I nodded once. She kept smiling. "We've had several residents mention concerns about the appearance of that structure behind your property." I looked over my shoulder at the levee. "You mean the flood barrier?" "Well," she said carefully, "that's not exactly how the community sees it." Community. That word again. I leaned on the shovel handle. "Ma'am, that levee's been here longer than your subdivision." She laughed softly like I'd told a harmless joke. "Yes, and we completely respect the history here. But Maple Ridge residents invested heavily in scenic property views. The board was hoping you'd consider landscaping improvements, maybe lowering portions of it." "Lowering it?" That caught my attention. I studied her face for a second. "You know what that levee does?" She crossed her arms. "I know it blocks the creek view from 7 homes." There it was. Not safety. Not drainage. The view. I remember noticing something then. Karen never once looked at the creek itself. She kept looking at the low basin behind the levee. measuring it, calculating. Like she wasn't seeing flood control. She was seeing real estate. I told her no as politely as I could. Thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 3 weeks later, the first letter arrived in my mailbox. Official HOA notice of community impact violation. That was the beginning. And looking back now, I think Karen Whitmore already knew exactly what she wanted from me before she ever stepped out of that Mercedes. The second letter showed up 5 days later. Certified mail this time. Karen had switched from community concerns to legal language almost overnight. According to the HOA board, my levy was now considered a visual obstruction negatively affecting downstream property values. I remember standing at the kitchen counter reading that sentence twice while my wife Ellie poured coffee beside me. Ellie looked over the paper. What exactly does that even mean? It means somebody paid a lawyer by the hour, I said. The letter demanded I either modify the levy within 30 days or attend a compliance hearing at the Maple Ridge clubhouse. Now, legally, they had no authority over my land. None. My property wasn't inside their subdivision boundaries. Never had been. But people like Karen counted on intimidation more than legality. Most folks hear words like violation hearing and compliance penalties and panic before they ever call an attorney. I called Wade Holloway. Wade's been handling agricultural and property law around Ashton County since the late 80s. Quiet guy, gray beard, talks slow enough to make you nervous. I drove into town the next morning and dropped both letters on his desk. He read them without speaking. Then he leaned back in his chair and let out one dry laugh through his nose. "Grant," he said, "these people are bluffing." "That's what I figured. They can't fine you. They can't enforce hearings. They can't regulate a structure on land they don't own." He tapped the letter again. "But they sure want you scared enough to cooperate." That part stuck with me. Because until then, I'd still been thinking this was about appearances. Wade wasn't. He was thinking motive. I asked him why an HOA would care that much about an old flood barrier hidden behind tree lines. He shrugged once. Money usually answers those questions. A week later, the harassment started getting stranger. Boats began showing up downstream near the culvert channels. Not fishing boats, kayaks, paddleboards. People drifting close enough to photograph the levee from the creek. One afternoon, I caught a man in loafers standing near my lower fence line taking measurements with his phone. Didn't even deny it when I walked up. Just smiled awkwardly and said, "The neighborhood committee's documenting environmental concerns." Environmental concerns? That was a new one. The following month, Karen escalated again. The HOA newsletter started mentioning uncooperative neighboring property owners, creating watershed uncertainty. No names. Didn't need names. Everybody knew who they meant. And slowly, I noticed something changing in town. People started asking questions at the feed store. At church? At the diner off Route 18. Nothing direct. Just careful little comments. "Everything all right with that drainage thing? Heard the county might get involved. You fighting with those Maple Ridge people?" That's how HOA pressure works sometimes. Not through law, through reputation. Karen wanted me isolated before she pushed harder. Then came the hearing notice. They scheduled it for November 14th at the Maple Ridge clubhouse and informed me failure to appear could result in continued financial enforcement actions. I almost ignored it completely. But Wade called me that afternoon. "Go," he said. "Why?" "Because I want to know what they actually want." So I went. The clubhouse looked like every suburban HOA meeting room in America. Fake stone walls, cheap chandeliers, coffee nobody drank. Karen sat at the center table wearing a navy blazer like she was chairing a Senate committee. About 20 residents sat behind her. Some annoyed, some curious. A few looked uncomfortable just being there. Karen smiled when I walked in. "Mr. Mercer," she said loudly, "thank you for finally participating in the community process. Community process. Again. I sat down across from her without answering. Then she slid a packet across the table. Site maps. Property sketches. Drainage diagrams? And right there in the middle, a highlighted section labeled Future Phase 3 Expansion. That caught my attention immediately, because the outlined expansion area sat directly behind my levee, exactly where floodwater naturally collected. Karen saw me staring at it. That was the first time her smile slipped a little. And in that moment, I realized the levee wasn't the problem. The land behind it was. I didn't say much during the rest of that HOA meeting, mostly because I wanted Karen to keep talking. People reveal more when they think they're winning. Karen stood beside the presentation board explaining Phase 3 like she was unveiling a luxury resort. Expanded waterfront access, enhanced creek visibility, premium southern lots. Every sentence sounded rehearsed, but the maps told the real story. The future expansion sat directly inside the natural flood basin my grandfather's levee had been controlling since Eisenhower was president. Without the levee, spring runoff would spread through that entire low section like a bathtub overflowing. I knew it. Wade knew it. And judging by the engineering diagrams in front of me, Richard Whitmore definitely knew it too. After the meeting ended, Karen stopped me near the parking lot. "Mr. Mercer," she said, smiling again, "I think tonight was productive." I looked at her for a second. "No," I said calmly, "tonight was informative." That smile faded a little. "Good." I drove straight to Wade's office the next morning with copies of the Phase 3 maps. He spread them across his desk under a yellow lamp and stayed quiet for almost 5 full minutes. Then he asked one question. "You know what a flood retention dependency study is?" I shook my head. Wade stood up and walked toward a filing cabinet. Developments built near regulated drainage zones usually need runoff impact analysis before approval, especially if there's existing flood control nearby. Nearby? That word mattered. 20 minutes later, he found what he wanted. County permitting records. Maple Ridge Estates Phase 1 approval documents. And buried inside the engineering packet was a hydrology report from 2019, prepared by a Nashville consulting firm. The report explained that seasonal flood pressure downstream was being naturally mitigated by what they called an existing elevated upstream retention barrier. My levee. They didn't name it directly. Didn't have to. The coordinates matched my property exactly. I read the report twice, then a third time. The development had been approved because county engineers believed the upstream floodwater was already being controlled. By me. Wade leaned back slowly. "Well," he said, "there it is." I looked up. They knew. Oh, they absolutely knew. I remember feeling strangely calm after that. Not angry. Just clear-headed. Like a puzzle finally snapping together. Karen never cared about the view. Richard never cared about landscaping. They wanted the levee gone because the basin behind it was worth millions if it could be developed. The floodplain itself was the target. And suddenly, every weird interaction over the past year made sense. The photographs, the fake violations, the pressure campaign, even the public shaming. They were trying to force me into removing the very thing protecting their own subdivision. I asked Wade something then. What happens if the levee actually comes out? He folded his hands together. That depends on rainfall. No, I said, realistically. Wade sighed. Grant, if you remove that structure legally, with county approval and proper environmental oversight, liability probably stops with you. And downstream? He looked at me carefully before answering. Maple Ridge floods. The room got very quiet after that. Outside his office window, traffic rolled slowly past the courthouse square. A man walked by carrying takeout coffee. Somebody laughed across the street. Normal life. Meanwhile, I was sitting there realizing an entire gated community had been built, counting on my family's land staying exactly the way it was forever. And now the same people benefiting from it were trying to destroy it. Wade broke the silence first. You thinking what I think you're thinking? I stared at the floodplain map spread across the desk. Then I nodded once. If they want it removed that badly, I said, maybe I should let them have exactly what they asked for. Wade studied me for a long moment. You serious? I thought about my grandfather building that levee by hand. About Karen treating my property like an obstacle. About those families downstream who probably had no idea what their HOA board was gambling with. Then I answered honestly, I don't know yet. But the truth was, for the first time since Karen Whitmore drove onto my property, I was no longer reacting to them. I was thinking ahead of them. And that changed everything. I didn't make the decision right away. For about 2 weeks, I kept living normally. Fed the horses. Cleared brush along the north fence line. Helped my son Caleb rebuild the transmission in his old Ford truck. But the whole time, that hydrology report stayed in the back of my mind. Especially one sentence. Existing upstream retention barrier provides critical overflow attenuation during severe rainfall events. Critical overflow attenuation. That was engineering language for this neighborhood stays dry because of your land. And somehow Karen Whitmore still thought she could bully me into removing it without consequences. By December, the HOA fines started arriving monthly. $5,000. Then 10. Then 25. Every letter looked more official than the last. Red stamps. Threatening language. Talk about liens and enforcement actions. Ellie taped every single one inside a kitchen drawer instead of throwing them away. Why keep them, I asked her one night. She shrugged. Because someday somebody's going to need to read all this. Turns out she was right. Right after Christmas, things escalated again. I came home from town one afternoon and found orange survey flags planted near the creek behind my levee. Private property? No permission. No notice. Just bright little markers running straight across the flood basin. Caleb was already outside waiting when I pulled in. You see this? He asked. I nodded. Somebody came through around noon, 2 trucks. We walked the property together. The flags formed a rough grid pattern. Future lot outlines. That's when it stopped being annoying and started feeling dangerous. I pulled every single flag out of the ground before sunset. The next morning, Karen called me personally for the first time in almost 3 months. Her voice sounded tight. Mr. Mercer, those markers were placed by authorized surveyors on my property. They were conducting preliminary development assessments for land you don't own. Long silence. Then she shifted tone immediately. Grant, we're trying to work with you here. Funny thing about people like Karen. The second intimidation stops working. They suddenly start pretending everybody's partners. I leaned back in my chair. No, I said calmly. You're trying to pressure me. That's unfair. What's unfair is trespassing survey crews. Another silence. Then finally she said it. We have investors involved now. There it was. Not residents. Not community concerns. Investors. I thanked her for clarifying and hung up. That same afternoon, I drove back into town and sat down with Wade again. I want to know what it takes to remove the levee legally, I told him. He stared at me for several seconds. You sure? No, I said honestly, but I want the option. So that's where things changed. Because once lawyers and engineers enter the picture, people stop dealing in emotions and start dealing in records. Wade connected me with a civil engineer named Martin Greeley, who specialized in watershed permitting across eastern Tennessee. Martin came out to the property the following week wearing muddy boots and carrying old topographic maps rolled under one arm. He spent 6 hours surveying the levee, creek channels, runoff slopes, and retention basin. At sunset, we stood together near the spillway culvert while cold wind pushed through the trees. Martin looked downstream toward Maple Ridge Estates. You know those homes sit lower than they should, right? I had a feeling. He nodded slowly, Whoever approved that development assumed this structure would remain permanently. I looked at the levee stretching across the basin. 70 years old. Still holding. Still protecting people who hated it? Martin shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. If you remove it properly, he said carefully, the county can't blame you for natural water movement afterward. I noticed he didn't say if. He said when. A week later, the official permit application paperwork arrived. And somehow, Karen Whitmore found out almost immediately. Because 3 days after I filed it, a black Escalade pulled into my driveway just before dark. And Richard Whitmore himself stepped out. Richard Whitmore didn't look nervous when he stepped out of that Escalade. That was the first thing I noticed. Men who still think they control the situation usually move slowly. Calm smile. Measured steps. Hands visible. He walked halfway up my driveway and stopped near the cattle fence while I stayed on the porch. Didn't ask permission to come closer. Smart enough not to. "Grant," he called out, "mind if we talk?" I walked down slowly. Cold wind was moving through the trees behind us, carrying the smell of rain and creek water. Richard looked older up close than he did in town advertisements. The expensive haircut and golf course clothes couldn't quite hide the exhaustion underneath. "You filed the permit," he said. I did. He nodded once like he'd expected it. Then he glanced toward the levee. That structure coming out would create problems. Funny hearing him say structure now. Not eyesore. Not obstruction. Not environmental concern. Problems. I crossed my arms. Your wife seemed pretty determined to get rid of it. Richard sighed through his nose. Karen gets aggressive sometimes. That almost made me laugh. Almost. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document. I can make the violations disappear, he said. There it was. Not a legal argument. A deal. I didn't take the paper from him. You mean the fake violations? His jaw tightened a little. Grant, nobody wants this thing escalating. Seems like your HOA already escalated it. For the first time since arriving, Richard stopped sounding confident. Because now he wasn't talking to some homeowner scared of paperwork anymore. He knew I understood the floodplain issue. And more importantly, he knew I understood why they wanted that land. Richard lowered his voice. Phase 3 represents a substantial investment. I looked toward the basin behind the levee. Bare winter trees. Low fog over the creek. Millions of gallons of controlled runoff sitting quietly where it belonged. How much, I asked. He hesitated, then answered honestly, north of 40 million. There it was, the real number behind all this insanity. $40 million sitting underwater behind my grandfather's levee. Richard stepped closer. Grant, if that permit moves forward, there are going to be consequences neither of us can control. I studied him for a long moment. You should have thought about that before your wife started threatening me. Another silence. Then Richard made the mistake that changed everything. You don't understand how many people are financially tied into this. Not homeowners. Not families. Financially tied into this? Investors again. Banks. Partnerships. Probably people outside Tennessee entirely. I looked him dead in the eye. Then maybe you built in the wrong place. That landed harder than he expected. His face changed after that. The politeness disappeared. Not fully angry yet, but strained. You remove that levee, he said quietly, and this becomes a very public situation. I nodded once. Seems like it already is? He stared at me for another few seconds before turning back toward the Escalade. Then right before getting inside, he stopped. One more thing, he said. You should ask yourself why county engineers approved Phase 1 so easily. And then he drove away. That sentence bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Because there was something buried inside it. Something ugly. The next morning I called Wade immediately. By noon we were sitting inside the county records office pulling development approvals going back 4 years. Most of it looked standard at first. Drainage studies, environmental reviews, floodplain assessments. Then Wade found a supplemental approval packet attached to the original Maple Ridge filing. A waiver request, signed by an assistant county zoning director named Alan Pierce. The waiver reduced required downstream flood mitigation infrastructure because the development already benefited from existing upstream retention conditions. My levy again. But this time there was an internal memo attached. Not public-facing. Probably uploaded accidentally. I read it twice, then a third time. Developer indicates upstream retention structure expected to be modified or removed within future expansion timeline. I felt my stomach go cold. Richard Whitmore had told county officials years earlier that my levy would eventually disappear. Not maybe. Expected, meaning Phase 3 had likely been planned around the floodplain from the very beginning. Wade looked over at me slowly. Grant, I already knew. Somebody inside county zoning had helped this happen. And suddenly, this wasn't just an HOA harassment story anymore. This was corruption. Real corruption? And if that was true, things were about to get a whole lot bigger than Karen Whitmore. Once you realize corruption's involved, you stop assuming people are bluffing. That changes how you move. Wade contacted a friend of his at the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation the following morning. By the end of the week, 2 state hydrology engineers were reviewing Maple Ridge's original floodplain submissions. Quietly, no public announcement, no headlines yet. Just professionals looking at paperwork that suddenly smelled wrong. Meanwhile, Karen completely lost patience. The HOA fines jumped from annoying to absurd almost overnight. $50,000 for unauthorized environmental obstruction. $75,000 for community flood risk interference. That one almost made me laugh considering what we just discovered. Ellie stopped reacting to the letters altogether. She'd simply open them, slide them into the kitchen drawer with the others, and go back to whatever she was doing, like she already knew the ending before anybody else did. 3 days later, somebody cut the chain on my south access gate. Didn't steal anything. Didn't vandalize equipment. Just drove through the property near the levee sometime after midnight. Caleb found fresh tire tracks the next morning. Wide tires. Probably an SUV. He stood there staring at the mud while cold fog drifted off the creek. You think that was them? I looked at the tracks for a long moment. Doesn't matter. I said, document everything. That became our routine after that. Photos. Dates. Camera footage. Copies of letters. Every interaction logged. Because once institutions start circling each other, paperwork becomes ammunition. And Karen still didn't understand that yet. A week later, the state engineers finally came out to inspect the levee in person. 2 men and 1 woman. Mud boots. Survey equipment. No nonsense. Richard Whitmore showed up 20 minutes after they did. Interesting timing. He climbed out of another expensive SUV wearing sunglasses and a forced smile that looked thinner every time I saw him. The lead engineer introduced herself as Denise Hollowell. She spent nearly an hour walking the levee and runoff basin while her team checked elevation markers downstream. Richard kept trying to insert himself into conversations. Talking too much. That's another thing guilty people do. At one point, Denise asked him directly, "Your development filings anticipated future modification of this structure." Richard smiled carefully. There were discussions about possible future improvements. Always softer language. Denise looked down at her clipboard. That's not what the county memo says. That hit him harder than I expected. His whole posture changed. For the first time since this started, I saw real concern on his face. Not irritation. Fear. By late afternoon, the engineers had seen enough. Before leaving, Denise pulled me aside near the creek bank. "Mr. Mercer," she said quietly, "has anyone ever explained to you how much water this levee actually holds back during heavy storms?" I shook my head. She glanced downstream toward Maple Ridge Estates. Well, based on what we're seeing, removing it would significantly alter flood behavior across that entire basin. Significantly, I repeated. She nodded once, then added something that stayed with me. The concerning part is that somebody appears to have known that already. That evening, the local news station ran a short segment about ongoing environmental review concerns involving Maple Ridge Estates. No accusations yet. But the story was out now. And once public attention enters a situation like this, people start panicking. Karen called me at 9:40 that night. Didn't even pretend to be polite anymore. "You brought state investigators into this." "No," I said calmly. "Your paperwork did." "You have any idea what kind of damage this could cause?" That word again. Damage. Always talking about future damage while ignoring the floodplain sitting under their own neighborhood. I stayed quiet. Karen's breathing sounded shaky over the line. Then finally she snapped, "You think you're going to win here because you own some dirt and an old pile of mud." I looked out the kitchen window toward the levee. Rain clouds were gathering low over the trees. "No," I said softly. "I think I'm going to win because your husband built houses where water already wanted to go." She hung up immediately. And 2 days later, somebody leaked the state review documents to the press. The story hit local television on a Thursday night. By Friday morning, everybody in Ashton County had an opinion about Maple Ridge Estates. Some people blamed me immediately. Others blamed the HOA. Most were just confused how a gated subdivision worth millions could have been built inside a questionable floodplain in the first place. That was the problem with public scrutiny. Once people start asking basic questions, complicated lies fall apart fast. The leaked documents spread everywhere. Facebook groups, county forums, even local church pages. Screenshots of engineering memos started circulating beside aerial flood maps of the basin behind my levee. And for the first time, Maple Ridge homeowners realized their own HOA may have been hiding things from them. That weekend, 3 different residents drove out to my property separately. Not angry. Nervous? One older couple stood near my gate holding printed copies of the news article. The husband looked embarrassed just being there. "Mr. Mercer," he said carefully, "is it true our neighborhood depends on your levee?" I looked at both of them for a second. "You should ask your developer that question." The wife spoke next. "Karen told us you were refusing environmental upgrades." That almost made me smile. Environmental upgrades. Amazing how language changes depending on who's telling the story. I walked them to the creek overlook behind the barn and pointed downstream toward Maple Ridge. Then I showed them the natural runoff basin stretching across the lowland behind the levee. "You see all that I asked?" The husband nodded slowly. "That basin fills first during heavy storms, always has." The wife looked pale already. "And if the levee goes," I answered honestly, "the creek takes the shortest path it can." Neither of them said another word after that. By Monday morning, the HOA board was in full panic mode. Emergency meetings, resident complaints, rumors about lawsuits. And then came the first resignation. A board member named Sheila Danner quit publicly through a Facebook statement saying residents had been misled regarding watershed risks associated with future development plans. That one sentence detonated the neighborhood, because now it wasn't just rumors anymore. Now insiders were talking. Karen tried fighting back. She posted a 4-page HOA statement accusing me of weaponizing environmental processes against the community. That phrase spread online so fast it ended up becoming a joke around town. Weaponizing environmental processes. Nobody even knew what it meant. But Karen kept doubling down because people like her don't know how to retreat gracefully. Only loudly. Tuesday afternoon I got another visit. This time it wasn't Richard. It was a man named Owen Pike. Late 60s. Retired insurance adjuster. Former Maple Ridge HOA treasurer. He arrived driving an old silver Tacoma with a banker's box strapped into the passenger seat. Right away I could tell he was scared. He kept checking his mirrors before getting out. "You Grant Mercer?" he asked. "That's me." He nodded toward the box. "We need to talk somewhere private." Ellie brought coffee, while Owen sat at our kitchen table looking like he hadn't slept in days. Then he opened the box. Inside were copies of HOA financial records, internal emails, engineering summaries, and insurance documents tied to Maple Ridge development loans. Wade arrived 20 minutes later after I called him. The four of us spent nearly 3 hours going through paperwork. And every page somehow made things worse. Richard Whitmore had apparently purchased supplemental flood insurance policies tied specifically to future hydrological alteration events. In plain English, he financially prepared for the possibility that my levee might disappear. Years ago, Owen rubbed both hands together nervously while Wade read through the policies. "They knew," Owen whispered. "Jesus Christ, they knew." According to the documents, some investors were already discussing potential FEMA buyouts before Phase 3 had even broken ground. That stopped the room cold. They weren't just gambling with flooding anymore. They were planning around it, profiting from it. Ellie finally spoke from across the kitchen. So these people were willing to risk flooding their own residence for development money. Owen looked down at the table. "Yes, ma'am." Nobody said anything for a while after that. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere far off beyond the creek basin. Then Wade slowly closed the last folder, and the look on his face told me something important. This had officially crossed beyond county corruption. Federal agencies were about to get involved. Federal investigators showed up the following Thursday. Not dramatic. No raid jackets. No flashing lights. Just 3 black SUVs pulling quietly into Wade Holloway's parking lot at 8:10 in the morning. Wade had asked me to meet there instead of the house. Probably smart. By then, the local news had started camping outside Maple Ridge's entrance every other day. The lead investigator introduced himself as Special Agent Curtis Vale with the FBI Financial Crimes Division out of Knoxville. Calm voice. No wasted words. He spent almost 4 hours reviewing the documents Owen Pike brought us. Insurance policies, internal HOA emails, development financing projections, floodplain communications. By noon, even the federal agents looked disturbed. One younger investigator leaned back in his chair and muttered, "They actually modeled post-failure acquisition values." That sentence stayed with me. Post-failure acquisition values. Meaning somebody had calculated how cheaply flooded homes could be bought after a disaster. Not if. After. Richard Whitmore hadn't just anticipated flooding. He'd built business plans around it. When the meeting finally ended, Agent Vale asked me one question before leaving. "Mr. Mercer, is the removal permit process still active?" "Yes, sir." "And are you still proceeding?" I looked over at Wade. "Then back at the agent." "Yes." He nodded once. "Good." That surprised me enough to ask why. Vale closed his folder slowly. "Because if the levee remains untouched, attorneys will argue these flood models were hypothetical. If it comes out legally and exactly what they predicted happens afterward." He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. The removal itself would expose everything. That same evening, the Tennessee Department of Environment officially approved the levee removal permit. Environmental compliance complete. Drainage transition procedures approved. County notification filed. Every signature in place. Completely legal. Karen Whitmore absolutely lost her mind. At 7:30 the next morning, she organized a protest outside my property. About 20 Maple Ridge residents showed up holding printed signs. "Save our homes. Stop the removal. Don't flood Maple Ridge." Funny thing was, half those people had no idea their own HOA spent 2 years trying to force the levee out in the first place. That was Karen's final trick. Pretend she'd been protecting the neighborhood all along. Local media arrived within an hour. News vans lined the county road while Karen marched around giving emotional interviews about reckless environmental retaliation. I watched the whole thing from my porch beside Ellie. She sipped coffee quietly while cameras rolled below. Then Karen made a mistake. She walked halfway up my driveway carrying a folder full of violation notices. And she started yelling loud enough for every microphone nearby to catch it. "You could stop this right now." I stayed calm. "You fined me for 2 years demanding removal." That was before. Before what? She stopped talking. Because there wasn't a safe answer. Not one the cameras would like. Ellie finally stood up beside me. Didn't raise her voice. Didn't sound angry. She simply looked at Karen and said, "You people spent years trying to force my husband into doing exactly what he's doing." Dead silence after that. Even the reporters stopped moving. Karen looked around, realizing every camera was pointed at her now instead of me. And for the first time since this entire thing started, she looked scared. The protest collapsed less than 20 minutes later. By sunset, 3 more HOA board members resigned publicly. Then things got even worse for the Whitmores. At 5:40 Friday morning, Richard Whitmore was detained at Nashville International Airport attempting to board a flight to Belize. That hit every news station in Tennessee before noon. Financial fraud. Development conspiracy. Federal investigation. And suddenly Maple Ridge Estates became national news. Karen disappeared after that. No more interviews. No more HOA statements. Nothing. Meanwhile, the levee removal crews arrived Monday morning exactly on schedule. Excavators. Surveyors. State environmental monitors. Everything documented by cameras from 3 separate agencies. I stood there watching machinery idle beside the same structure my grandfather built 70 years earlier with county farmers and Army surplus equipment. Strangest feeling of my life. Not victory. Not guilt. Just inevitability. Ellie squeezed my hand once while storm clouds gathered far out over the hills. Then she looked toward the darkening sky and said quietly, "They still don't understand what that levee was holding back." The first section of the levee came down at 9:14 Monday morning. Slowly. Carefully. State engineers monitored every cut while runoff crews redirected creek flow through temporary channels beside the basin. Nothing dramatic happened at first. That's the thing people misunderstand about flood systems. Disasters usually begin quietly. By sunset, almost a third of the retention wall had been removed. Water that normally spread across my basin started moving downstream faster and narrower through the natural creek channel. Exactly like the original terrain intended. State crews documented every stage with drones and elevation scans. Every measurement recorded. Every procedure legal. And all afternoon, weather alerts kept getting worse. Heavy storm warnings. Flash flood watches. Then overnight, the forecast shifted. A stalled storm system moving north out of Mississippi locked directly over eastern Tennessee. By 2 a.m., rain started hammering the county hard enough to wake me from sleep. I walked onto the porch wearing boots and a canvas jacket while thunder rolled over the hills. The creek already sounded different. Faster. Angrier. Ellie stepped beside me holding 2 cups of coffee. Neither of us spoke for a while. We just listened. By sunrise, the county emergency alert system had issued flood warnings across 3 districts downstream. Maple Ridge Estates sat directly in the center of all 3. At 8:17 a.m., Caleb's phone buzzed with the first homeowner video from inside the subdivision. Water across the southern roadway. Storm drains overwhelmed. Retention ponds overflowing. By 9:40, basement flooding had started. And by 10:15, Maple Ridge Estates officially lost control of the water. The creek reclaimed the floodplain exactly the way it had before my grandfather ever built that levee. Street after street started taking runoff. Brown water surged through landscaped walking paths and overflowed decorative stone walls like they weren't even there. Emergency crews rolled in before noon. Sheriff's deputies, county rescue trucks, fire response teams, news helicopters overhead. Everything from the opening of this story finally happening in real time. And through all of it, nobody could claim negligence. The removal was legal, documented, approved, publicly scheduled weeks in advance. The storm itself wasn't even historically rare, just strong enough. That's all it took. Around noon, one of the state engineers approached me while we watched floodwater spread across live drone footage inside a mobile command trailer. "You know what the worst part is?" he asked quietly. I shook my head. He pointed toward the screen. This was avoidable. That stayed with me because he was right. Every bit of it. The homeowners never caused this. Most of them had no clue what had been hidden underneath the development plans. They trusted the wrong people. By late afternoon, federal investigators arrived at Maple Ridge alongside state officials. Financial records were seized. Development permits suspended. County Zoning Director Alan Pierce resigned before sunset. Richard Whitmore remained in federal custody. And Karen finally reappeared around 6 o'clock that evening. Completely soaked. Mascara streaked down her face. Standing near the flooded subdivision entrance while reporters surrounded her with cameras and microphones. Then she saw me. I was standing beside a sheriff's deputy near the emergency barricades, holding the same manila folder from months earlier. Karen walked straight toward me through ankle-deep water. "You knew this would happen," she said. Not yelling anymore. Just broken. I opened the folder calmly. Inside were every HOA violation letter she'd ever mailed me. I handed the top copy to the deputy beside us. "Your HOA demanded removal repeatedly," I said quietly. I complied legally. Karen stared at the paperwork like she'd never seen it before. Then her shoulders collapsed. Because in that moment, she finally understood something people like her almost never understand until it's too late. Power doesn't protect you from consequences, especially when those consequences were your own idea. 3 months later, Maple Ridge HOA officially dissolved. Multiple fraud indictments followed. Several homeowners sued the development company successfully, and the floodplain behind my property. County Conservation bought most of it before anybody else could touch it. Sometimes people ask if I regret removing my grandfather's levee. Truth is, no, because the levee did exactly what it was built to do for 70 years. The real problem was the people downstream who thought they could erase history without understanding why it existed in the first place. You know, the older I get, the more I realize most people don't lose everything because of one big mistake. They lose it because pride convinces them they're smarter than consequences. Karen and Richard Whitmore thought money, lawyers, and pressure could bend reality around them. They believed they could erase history, ignore nature, and intimidate the one person standing in the way of their plans. But some things exist for a reason long before we arrive, and wisdom means understanding that before we try to tear them down. What hurts most is that innocent families paid the price for trusting the wrong people. Those homeowners weren't villains. Most of them had no idea what was happening behind closed doors. And honestly, that's a lesson all by itself. Always ask questions when powerful people insist everything is under control. I'd really love to hear your thoughts on this story. If you were in Grant Mercer's position, what would you have done? Would you have fought the HOA in court for years, or would you have done exactly what they demanded and let the consequences speak for themselves? Drop your thoughts down in the comments. I read as many as I can, and these conversations are honestly my favorite part of this channel. And if you enjoy slow burn HOA revenge stories, property disputes, legal drama, and stories where calm people finally push back against corruption, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.